Hello and welcome to Dark Loops, The Divide. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist philosopher from Illinois State University. And in tonight's episode, we discuss the Amazon Prime series, Them. Gentlemen, please tell us who you are and how you feel your expertise will contribute to our understanding of the divide. And we will begin with Steve Hunt.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Steve Hunt, and I'm professor and director of the School of Communication here at Illinois State University. I love this group. We've done a lot of interesting things together, and this is just an extension of that. And one of the things that got me interested in them is based on some previous work that we've done together that we'll probably talk about tonight, but my interest in persuasion and civic and political engagement, in political communication and in political polarization and the pedagogy of anti-racism. And I think there's so many deep connections to this series, to those interests. So those are some of the things that really draw me to them.
No, fantastic. So glad that you're part of this. And we'll move on to Byron.
Hi, I'm Dr. Byron Craig. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Communication. That was my boss that just taught. And so for me, I come to this with an interest in, I'm a rhetorician, so an interest in how we can see trauma through this show. And we can talk a little later about how it's been critiqued as trauma porn, which I kind of want to push back on because of some revelations I've had about the show. But also because I have a background in African-American studies as well. And in this show, thinking about, this notion of divide here kind of ties into some themes, or a big theme that I want to talk about tonight with something that I noticed, which is going on in politics right now. And it has to do with Cheney and the vote today.
Fantastic. Excellent. And Nathan.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nathan Carpenter, Director of Convergent Media for the School of Communication. Sometimes they call me Dr. Smack because I run our Social Media Analytics Command Center, or the SMAC as it's commonly known. And most of my work really for this kind of group and my interests around the social media conversations. And so I spend probably way too much time just tweaking little scripts and computer programs to collect data from places like Twitter and find ways to analyze and visualize all that information. But the topic I think is also incredibly interesting historically, and I think about a lot of my own family narratives that I think are really entwined in this series. Again, I think from the white perspective and the Protestant immigrant perspective as well, which I think I'll definitely be talking about. I hope I'll be talking about tonight too. Mm-hmm. So a couple interests, one being personal, but second professional, again, being the data and analytics guy here.
Fantastic. And Steve.
Well, my name is Dr. Steve Rocco. I'm a lecturer at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. And I'm delighted to join all of you here tonight, my colleagues from the other Bloomington. I'm in Indiana. So, I'm also a scholar of rhetoric. I have a degree in communication studies, and, I consider myself a rhetorical critic. And my interest in rhetoric from a scholarly perspective is really looking at the intersections of capitalism and race. And so for me, I come to this series with an interest in looking at how it represents race and the violence of the history of capitalism. And it becomes an interesting text that kind of intersects with popular culture in that sense. It offers sort of an interesting kind of narrative of the history of capitalism and race. It offers an interesting audience a sense of a kind of way of thinking about that history of the present, how we got to this point, because I think that the kind of historical context of this show is rather interesting. Its reception in this era right after the Trump administration, right after the insurrection on January 6th. So it really brings together a lot of kind of themes of our contemporary social, historical, and political moment that I think that for scholars such as ourselves, we need to interrogate, make sense of, critique, and offer commentary that hopefully offers a productive way of thinking about this as a way of kind of opening up spaces in our public discourse that are currently kind of enclosed by hyper fragmented media networks, hyper kind of fragmented ontologies and the likes. So I'm excited and I'm looking forward to perspectives.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm going to pick up exactly where you left off. As I said, I'm a cognitive psychologist philosopher, and your comment about ontologies, for me, rhetorics, word systems are sort of this cognitive skin of one's ontology, right? They tell you what one is keeping in and what is keeping out. And one thing I've just very much enjoyed working with this crew is we're so knee deep in Twitter, you seeing all the language people are using to keep some in, to keep some out, and to manage those boundaries. For me, I'm always looking for a rhetorical system that admits to that aspect of our nature, yet works to be more and more inclusive. So, I've talked about Watchmen with these gentlemen, Lovecraft Country with these gentlemen. All three of these have addressed generational Black trauma, and I would argue in somewhat different genres. And so I'm just thrilled to be here and talk to you about this version in the horror genre and how it might challenge our rhetoric and the cognitive skin of our ideas as we go forward. So really looking forward to this.
Hey, can I share at least the top retweeted content?
Yeah, of course, please.
We'd spend all night going through all of it, but if I just show you the top 10, I think this might lend itself to additional critique or commentary as well. So yeah, let me pull this up here real quick.
So just as Nathan's doing that, I do want to tell you an experience, guys, that I have while watching this is there's no way I'm going to try to provide analytic critique of this level of trauma. All right. It's just like when Byron and I were podcasting Lovecraft Country together. Episode 9 of Lovecraft Country was a sacred episode to me. It's something that you just observe, you don't analyze. And by the time we got to episode 9 in this show, I have to admit, I felt a little guilty trying to do something more than just witness what they were trying to tell me. I just wanted to put that out there in case any of the rest of you had that kind of experience.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to try to hold it into, because I think that there's so many reactions you can have, and I think that's maybe one of the benefits then of also looking at the social media conversation and the
Yep.
responses there, because then you can start to pick those apart and kind of say, where do I fit here without ever having to actually say anything, right?
Mhm.
And to negotiate others' feelings and kind of practice a little bit of that. I don't know, could we call it empathy?
There you go.
Yep. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight these a moment. And again, one of the things that's a little superficial that I will do with social media data is just look at what's getting attention or what's getting rebroadcast. But I think it's useful to see this for a variety of reasons. I think one, just to see, again, if anybody else is on Twitter, if it's been retweeted a lot and you don't know much else about the show, that's going to frame your perception. And so just kind of running through, I think we can see a couple threads. I mean, one, the thing that got the most retweets in my data set is just somebody restating the line, "Hold my purse," right? And we all know exactly what scene that is, right? And in some ways, you kind of want that to be like the iconic scene, but there's so much else that happens that's much more rich and interesting. And then here, Byron, here's where those critiques really come out of the really labeling this as a series that's, about, trauma porn or Black trauma. And this first one from Angelica Bastian says, I'm comfortable calling this one of the most anti-Black pieces of pop culture I've seen, which was really interesting. I need to actually go in and read that article in depth. I skimmed it for a moment just to see where she went. And that's a really interesting critique based on everything we've been saying, for somebody to say this is the most anti-Black pieces of pop culture. As we keep going, we've got Deborah Arinde, who's she plays Lucky, and so she was just on the night of the premiere, sharing links to it. So there it is. There's some comments just on the character of Lucky, just commenting on how stunning she is. But then, we've got some down here that I think are also really interesting that generate some conversation. This one from Real More says, people are complaining about some of the grotesque scenes of this series, but it was this scene right here that was scarier than anything in the whole series, and talking about the redlining scene, right? And I think that was pretty commentary that showed that they were seeing the show as important commentary. And then we've got a few more here about, it's depressing, traumatic, making Black people suffer for entertainment. Racist violence is asking people, how far is too far? I'm honestly bored of this being repackaged to fit a horror narrative. So I think that's, it was really dominating the conversation in terms of what was getting reshared, and what was getting broader attention and what most people might have seen about the series. And again, it's something I kind of thought about and mentioned earlier, that that may have changed a lot of ways that people were seeing the show, because it's, you're not following episode by episode. You're getting somebody's complete take of the entire episode before you even, or the entire series before you even watch it. And so, this may be the only podcast that's actually talking about the important critiques being made, because everybody else has already written it off.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you showed those, Nathan. I mean, I think it's really interesting that, and I've seen some of these critiques. I mean, I have friends on Facebook who just refuse to watch it. But I had to tell you, and boy, when we put this out, I'll probably get slammed. But I'm going to go back to Toni Morrison again, and talk about Beloved, right? And that novel Beloved, you probably have one of the hardest scenes ever to read, where Setha kills her babies to keep them from going back to the plantation, right? And I can remember people saying, why would I read this? And then the other complaint was, how could this woman kill her children, right? And if you notice, this kind of becomes a theme in them also, right? Where Lucky's imagining her friend telling her, about a way to, we know that this man wants them to kill their children anyway, right? And, it plays around with this. But, to me, I guess, there is a horror in Blackness in America. And I guess that's what I think frustrates me when I read these, a horror about being, with being, that comes with being Black in America. And I think it's just an ingenious way to really think about, because it's not making us the horror, it's making, I'm sorry to say this, but it's making whiteness the horror, right? And it's, and so I'm thinking, if you read this in this way, we are looking at these horrific acts that have been done against Black folk, the show makes perfect sense to me, right? Yeah, we see these things that, Lucky and Henry and the family have to go through. But I guess for me, I'm like, well, darn, that's kind of my everyday existence. So, I mean, how can I not appreciate seeing that played out, in a fictionalized drama, but it's still, to me, it's putting that horror on to the other body, not onto my body, not onto my Black body, right? I get to experience I get to see, and some people will say, yeah, well, we know the horror of the horrors of how whiteness is done to the Black body. But to me, I think it's kind of cathartic, I guess maybe that's the word, to see that played out. And nothing against you all on here, but because it sounds kind of mean, but I got a satisfaction out of seeing that and saying, yeah, damn, these people have just been incredibly horrible, right? And horrible, and the horrors that they have done to our bodies, right? And I think every Black person, I mean, I shouldn't say every Black person, but I know that I can think of stories that my mother told me, that of things that happened that she witnessed, that to me were just frightening. And I was like, well, damn, this is scary. And I mean, not past, but even when we moved onto our street and the neighbors across the street who just would not speak, that's a horror that's done to Black folk, right? Because you're not wanted there. Well, just like in this show. But to me, that's what was fascinating about it, and that's what fascinates me about people saying they just don't want to watch another show like this. And I'm like, yeah, but it's kind of, I don't know. People have said they didn't see this like a Get Out. I'm like, well, I kind of thought it was better than Get Out, honestly, right? For me, because it's dealing with the really hardcore acts of horror that happen that are racist acts, right? And it's a way of making racism even stronger in the American psyche, because we know the horror genre presents this thing that's meant to chill us, right? And I think that's what this show does. And how we can think of racism, how we can think of, police acts of police brutality. These things are chilling to us, and they chill us to our core. And in a way, they become these kind of modes of horror, I think. So I don't know. I'll let someone else go, but
I think what's interesting is it would be interesting to compare the Twitter data on audience reaction to them, and then also to like a film like 12 Years a Slave, which was, nominated for how many Oscars? I don't know what makes the violence different between, 12 Years a Slave and them. The way it dramatizes violence is different. I mean, they're different genres. One's kind of historical era realism, right? This is horror. But the audience reaction was very different back when that film came out, right? I mean, there were a number. I remember when Byron and I saw the film in Bloomington, Indiana, we had white friends who would. I think the reaction to the film after that from white people was, "I'm so sorry." Like somebody put their hand on your back, right? Friend of ours.
Are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I know this story.
But to me that's interesting, right? I mean, to compare it to Get Out, I mean, to me Get Out is an interesting parallel, but there's a lot of differences between this series and Get Out that we could get into. I don't want to kind of drive us in a different direction per se, but I think that what becomes really interesting is that within American culture, there's such a tendency to treat the slavery, the antebellum era, as sort of distinct. It's like, oh, well, that was the Mulligan. That was American liberal democracy's Mulligan, right? That's all past. Now it's time to like start over, right? I mean, there's really kind of a desperate investment, especially among white people, with this break. And I think why Lincoln becomes such an interesting symbolic figure in America's political imaginary for this reason, right? But I mean, I think that there's something there. Another thing that I think is important here too is, when I hear this Twitter data, a book that comes to mind that I think really helps answer this problem to an extent is a book that came out from Duke University Press by Nicholas Salmond in 2005. It's called Babes in Tomorrowland: Walt Disney and the Making of the American Child, 1930 to 1960. And some of you may be familiar with this, but it's a great historical analysis and a cultural studies analysis of how Disney basically became a brand, and how it was responding to mass culture, and how what Disney did was to basically say, oh, well, there's all this bad mass culture that's so corrupting of the youth, and that's so corrupting of our culture, right? But here's this good popular culture that you can consume, that's wholesome, and that's actually going to, like, you know, engender or constitute good childhoods, right? Or good people. And this is, I think, one of the biggest problems with American culture, and the way it relates to its own popular culture, is that it wants to create, like, there's the good popular culture and then there's the bad popular culture. And you know, that binary seems to kind of go through the way people read text. Is this contributing to, like, something wholesome, or is it not, right? And then there's this whole media effects thesis that somehow media is always causing, you know, shootings or violence. And it becomes really, I think, a rather unfortunate and simplistic way of thinking about these texts. Because, you know, as Byron and I we were watching the series, we frequently commented that, you know, what this show does that's really interesting, I think very unique, and what I would really push back against this notion that this on tropes of anti-blackness in ways that you rarely see in popular culture. I mean, it's naming all the kinds of historical stereotypes. I mean, these characters are calling, I mean, these white characters are calling the Emerys Mammy, Buck, right? They're going well out of their way to, you know, use kind of, you know, think about the scene with Ruby in the school where they're all, you know, treating her like she's a gorilla, right? And then, like, whatever we're gonna say about, like, this kind of, like, alter ego, or this ghost that kind of haunts the Emerys, it's on the one hand kind of like stereotypes, you know, like, for instance, like the kind of figure that's following Henry, for instance, right? So you get, like, these stock kind of representations in popular culture, right? In that sense, but then you also get, in the case of Ruby, her demon or her ghost is a fantasy of being white.
Yeah.
So it really plays with the complexity of this very well. And I kind of ask the audience, what genre is going to best negotiate these complexities of race and trauma and horror, right, and violence? You know, you can try to do a historical narrative, but then it just gets passed off as, oh, well, that's the past. Well, let's leave the past, like 12 Years a Slave, right? I mean, this show takes place, right, in the present. It's a not too distant present, right? Not too distant past, right? Which makes it, again, I think, maybe more uncomfortable for the audience to deal with, right? And again, you know, I'll just say this one more point. I'm kind of going on, but you know, one of the things about this show is that it shows you the extent to which these white characters are comfortable with violence on the Black body, with violence on the racial other, how much they tolerate it, how much they need it to drive their own self-identity. And so I guess, you know, I'm not going to tell anybody how to read this from their own kind of experience, their own kind of racialized experience, but as a white person, as a white critic, you know, I found this to be a really compelling representation of what I know, what I've seen, right? And I think, you know, for me, it does a lot in that sense. That's pushing the discourse. It's pushing our way to kind of think about race relations in ways that, again, we don't really see very often in popular culture.
I think that's fantastic. I think we've been watching white versions of horror for a century, right? And how can we expect that traumas happen in a culture and it doesn't become a horror story? I mean, it's almost as if there's an avoidance response that kicks in. And for me, these movies are like public events. Now, these days, they're not public events because you're watching them in your own home, but we're all watching the same event. And then we all sort of discuss it and cast judgment on it, if you like. And for me, this was, I don't like to use words should or whatever. This was somewhat inevitable that this type of story would be told this way. And when I reflect again on what I personally experienced as I went through it, there is this art critic kind of self that kicks in, and I'm looking for, is the writing this and that. And I was experiencing myself going through that. And I have to say that when I got to episode 9, there was just no space for criticism. It was, in other words, everything that had happened to everyone else psychologically turning in on certain things, episodes 1 through 8, it's all kind of a macrocosm in EPSI in that one episode, this turn. And where that turn ends, it's just like, for me, discussion over. I could no longer experience it as poetic in the sense of fodder for conversation. It was almost testament. And I'm not telling you that's what it was. What I'm telling you is that's how I experienced it, much like I experienced episode 9 of Lovecraft Country with, what was his name? Montrose. Staring out over burning Tulsa, reading off the names of those who had passed with the possible futures pulsating behind him in the background. Just stunning. And for me, there's just no words. So for me, this is public square common event stuff. Common event meaning we all share it. And while I feel myself judging it, that's for me not what it's about. It's about getting a narrative into the world to do exactly what we're doing here, to have different conversations about whiteness and not to tell it what it was, but to examine what we think we are as we encounter these kind of events. And in that sense, I think it was extremely successful. One last thing, I text on my phone to myself as I write emails to myself when I watch these things, so I can sort of keep notes, just a little bit, so I don't have to, episode 9, I just put the phone down after 5 minutes. There was nothing to write. There was no analysis to be done. And I think as a writer, that's just a massive accomplishment. Now it's going to collapse into this description of torture porn for some, and I understand why that would. For me, it was just, okay, Scott, just shut up and witness. That's the phenomenology I had. And I think I got the impression that's kind of what they're after.
We haven't really talked a lot about episode 5 yet.
Yeah.
All right, well, there we
But
go.
I think it fits given where we are in this conversation right now. And without doing a detailed analysis of the plot line and what happens in that episode, one of the things that I did is I went back and I looked at some interviews. I saw an interview that Deborah Iorendi did talking about that episode, and her talking about how that was hands down the most difficult thing she's ever had to do as an actor. And I thought what was really interesting about what she said was that, she felt a responsibility, that she wanted anybody who had ever experienced anything like this, that, that they are seen, that they are heard, and that they are acknowledged. And in talking about episode 5, but this also is a reflection on the entire series, Little Marvin in an interview said, Black people are flattened so easily. Trayvon Martin is not a hashtag. Emmett Till is not a hashtag, was not a hashtag, 13-year-old boy. And he makes the point that it's often been the children that are that receive this kind of violence. And he said, with respect to episode 5 in particular, I needed a scene that ripped through the screen and grabbed a viewer by the jugular and forced them to contend with a history of violence against Black bodies. And I think, that criticism that people, it's trauma porn, or gosh, why are you forcing us to watch this? As if this hasn't happened.
No.
Scott, is it their cognitive dissonance and they don't want to experience dissonance anymore, and they just want to push it away and don't expose me to this? I think the way that the series was put together, the way that episode was done, the whole series was genius. As you said, that it really forced you to confront this, and it didn't hide from it.
Well, I think the writers can see the different constellations of reactions as success. And what I mean is, culturally, we're in what systems theorists would call a phase transition, a destabilization of whiteness that leads to all kinds of competing views and all kinds of different views on what we are, what the world is. And to have this event occur in this destabilized state, one would predict these constellation of different reactions. My reaction, of course, to that episode was horror. At the same time, there's a question I have for all of you. Why did they write the white characters as if they were mentally disabled? Every one of them was written as if they were somehow diagnosably mentally disabled. And I thought I couldn't figure out that writing choice.
Well, I would phrase it this way, Scott. I think you're right, but I think that when I think about episode 5, and this is my favorite episode of the series, and what I love so much about this episode is that it gives you sort of the two bookends of racism in the United States. This episode begins with redlining. It begins with the kind of like institutional structural racism. It gets into beginning part of episode 5 is when they're showing all of these white kind of, real estate brokers, bankers in a room kind of carving up Los Angeles.
Yep.
No, it reminded me so much of the scene in The Godfather Part 2, where they basically have the cake of Cuba and they're carving out this into their domains, right? I mean, it had that resonance. You rarely see this in popular culture. The other reference that came to mind was The Big Short, when they have like these kind of anecdotes where they're trying to explain the complexities of capital markets. This was, they were doing that with kind of humor and kind of irony. This was, serious. This was a kind of realist representation here. And the way in which they're talking about how they're just pitting races against each other in redlining, and then the way in which they're basically kind of systematically building a bubble that they're all going to benefit from, and that's going to then destabilize the social life of Los Angeles. And I think what's interesting is that those characters were not mentally disabled at all, right? They weren't handicapped, right? They're representing the kind of like very dark kind of institutional, like instrumental reason of whiteness, right? We're going to, and again, one of the things that I also want to put on the table is, we've talked about the covenants. The other part of the covenant is the contract. And that's another theme of this series, the way in which the contract, right, plays within space. Covenants are always with space, with time, within some kind of like metaphysical being, like a god or whatnot. The contract also rules space, right? Rules property. Yep. And it's almost like space is a character in this series, right? You see this from the very beginning of the first episode where they're showing us the map of Los Angeles and the redlining, right? But that's the contrast, right? I think you see this kind of like very evil kind of maniacal, rational figures at the beginning of this episode. But then, of course, we move into, this kind of working class, this kind of handicap, and this handicapped whiteness that then is resentful. And so I think that's the complexity I saw. I'm not, what everybody else wants to add on or critique me, feel free.
So
Byron, can't hear you, Byron.
Oh, you can't hear me? Can you hear me?
I couldn't for a second. Go ahead.
So I want to pick up on the word resentful. So I guess I didn't see those characters as being written as having some kind of mental disability. I saw them written as being just nasty. I hate to use this term, right? As just monstrous, who are, just vile, a vile representation of whiteness that refuses to see the Black body as human. So I guess I didn't.
I see what you're saying.
And I can kind of see where people might get that ideal because of the way that they look. Right. So the guy that's standing back with, I don't know if she's their mother or what she is. But let's talk about the woman first. She's very deliberate.
Yes.
In the way she says Black. Right. So she knows
the choice of her song.
The choice of her song, right? And the way she vocalizes and plays with that word black, like she says it, right? And then I think, you know, with and I don't know if these are her boys or who they are, these are her sons or what they are, but I think they're just idiots, and I think they just don't see. I shouldn't
Yep.
use those kind of terms, but I think they just don't see. I think they're representative of not of not seeing the Black body as a human body, and I think that's for me. That's what I saw. Was not any kind of, you know, any kind of mental illness or anything, but just a viciousness of, we're going to treat them like a cat, and we're going to treat her like a piece of meat, because they obviously can't be human, because they're not like us. They're not as good as us. And also, and I think, excuse me, Steve kind of referenced this, they're a threat to me also.
Yeah.
Because they shouldn't have that house, right? Which is kind of what that whole episode's also about, right? This whole housing thing. I think they were very threatened by the fact that, how dare they have this house? How
Yeah.
dare she have this beautiful, perfect baby, right? How dare they be able to live here? So we have to destroy whatever they are, because they're not human. And I think that's what I think we were painting to see that as this kind of, you know, they were trying to show this as this, you know, this is the ugliness of not treating humans as humans.
So what I love about that is, if we take that description of those characters and then we take the description of the bankers that Steve mentioned, there's a story that comes through of ugliness from at all levels of mental functioning, right? From the most primitive to the most intellectually sophisticated. Because when the bankers are sitting around, they're bringing they're being highly evilly rational, right? They're bringing their best cognitive resources to bear in order to do the same, metaphorically do the same sort of thing that was being done in the other scene. In that sense, then I see the connection. I have to admit, when I saw that scene in the house, I couldn't tell, this could have been done by white people who were cognitively there, didn't seem to be challenged. So I wasn't sure why they were challenging. But when I then compared to the way Steve described the other scene, it's basically a way of saying evil through and through, right? From
Yeah.
basic thought to sophisticated thought. And
I think it's an ugliness, because if we go back to episode 9, at the end of episode 9, you know, if you notice the looks on the Dutch people's faces,
Yep.
as bodies are burning, right? Well, they look, you know, think about the lynching postcards. Look at those people's faces. If you take a close look at those people's faces, well, they look absolutely ignorant and idiotic, because they're enjoying death and torture, right? And I think I think for me, that's what I saw in that scene in episode 5. The downright, I just hate to keep using these kind of words, stupidity of you thinking that you can destroy these bodies and it's okay, right? There was this CNN ran this wonderful documentary for 2 weeks about the Klan versus the US, or the US versus the Klan, right? And you saw these people on the stand, these Klan members on the stand, and they look absolutely, I mean, whenever you see these people, and not to say that they all like that, right? But this is ignorance about these people that kind of comes through on the expression that you see with them. And not all of them, right? Because there can be, you know, politicians who are, well, they look idiotic too. So no, they all look idiotic to me. I guess that's, I see just this kind of, I hate to keep stressing that, but I just see this dumbness on their faces. But that's what I saw in that episode 5 with the bankers, to the rapist, to episode 9 with the Dutch watching the burning and the lynching and putting their eyes out. To me, it's just, when I see that, I guess I see, wow, y'all just some ignorant MFs, right? That's what I see. That's what I see displayed. So I don't I don't think of it as any kind of mental illness, because they play around with that too, right? When Lucky's put into the mental institution.
Right.
And so and how these Black bodies are also treated, which is kind of, we can think about Lovecraft Country, right, with the medical experiments, right, in that episode. But it's so even that doctor in that episode, right, when she's talking, she just looks evil and ignorant to me, because I know what she wants to do, right? And so I guess for me, anytime I see this mistreatment of Black bodies by these white characters, I see just an ignorance and an evilness.
And would you go far as to say like possession almost, that seems to be the change in some of the characters too, like we're talking about Hiram as well, like that change. I mean, it's like a literal possession that ends up happening, but I know I would see the same thing too, where these characters did not seem to be mentally incapacitated to me. It was like they were like zombies, right? Like they were truly monstrous, like you already said, Byron. And the monstrous to me is like there are times that you can see it, and it's almost scarier when it's glazed over by a pretty face, right? And I think those are the contrasts that come out. And I totally agree with the ignorance, right? Like it's just like visibly there. And so one thing that they did really well was take this ignorance and then show how people enjoyed being ignorant together. In other words, it wasn't just one ignorant person by themselves. It was, okay, we've all collapsed into this ignorant state, and we're doing this together, and I belong to part of this enjoyable group that's doing this horribly cruel thing.
Mob ignorance.
And the spectacle of it amplifies, I would argue, the intensity of the event that they're creating amplifies the sense of in-group cohesion. And the bizarre, we would see it as bizarre satisfaction they'd come by torturing others as a group. I think they did that very well throughout the story in different ways.
So this conversation is actually really making me kind of think about this episode differently than when I watched it. And I want to throw this out here. So, one of the things we've talked about this series is that it seems to be chronicling kind of the history of different kind of racial arguments, or kind of different ways in which the other is racialized. We see all these different kinds of documentations, and episode by episode of the way in which these white characters interact with Black characters, whether it's in this kind of prehistory of Compton to 1950s Compton, the way in which they name each other by these different kind of racial stereotypes, all these different kinds of scenes where it's like, for instance, like Henry in the elevator, the Invisible Man, all these different ways in which Black labor is exploited, whether it's, Grafton on the settlement, when he builds the well and then gets no credit for it, all the white characters take credit for it, right? And then they're described as Black magic. To then the defense contractor, right? The Department of Defense contract, and the way in which Henry then is his contribution is not acknowledged, and it's not compensated financially, right? One of the things that I find interesting in this conversation is we're talking about the white characters as if they're like rational. We're using that kind of like, and it makes sense that we should. But what if we thought of it this way? One of the things that I thought about with the beginning part, I want to get back to the earlier part of episode 5, because what you're seeing here is really kind of a prehistory of predatory capitalism. You're seeing a prehistory of predatory lending, right? And it's interesting to see this 10 years after the financial crisis, right? And the way in which predatory loans and predatory lending was used to destroy the wealth of the Black and brown middle class during the Great Recession, right? When the values of those homes were destroyed, that's what came with it, right? And there's lots of documentation of this, right? Lots of economic documentation of this. You know, the thing that's interesting is if we think about this beginning part of episode 5 as kind of like this prehistory of predatory lending, how do we see this white violence and these white hillbilly characters that, you know, rape Lucky, right? What happens if we see them as a super predator? If we name them that way, right? Because again, the show does not use the language of predator, but the show is visually representing a kind of predator. And I say this because again, you know, this show this show reveals how whiteness projects its own fantasies of violence and its own fears, right, and its own status anxieties onto the racial other as sort of a permission structure for then enacting violence in its own kind of self-interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think about like, you know, that infamous phrase Hillary Clinton used in the mid-90s that kept coming up, right? The super predator, right? And when a phrase like that is used in the mid-1990s, it's used in a dehumanizing way, right? When Black criminality is discussed, it's pathologized, right? It's not rational, it's just beyond rational, right? We're using different kinds of language to describe that, right? Yeah. And I wonder what happens when we think of these white characters committing this horrific act on Lucky as a kind of act of the act of a super predator that's then kind of narratively tied to these other larger kind of structures of institutional kind of predatory capitalism.
Yep. I agree with you completely. Scales of predators, right? To the point where the individual, the group, the corporation, the bank, the culture. And interestingly enough, in that scene we saw on the bank, the words they were using in no way hid their intentions. I mean, they were just open with each other about, yes, we are predators. You go further into the future in our lived lives, and there's a whole rhetoric that gets thrown on top of these practices post-Reagan regarding individual choice and freedom and all these sorts of things that puts the wolf in sheep's clothing, right? And so I did appreciate the sort of lack of pretense in the way those bankers were talking to each other about their status as predators. And I think in our time, I mean, there's a segment of our population that's just straight up, no, we're predators, you know. And there's also, I would just say post-Reagan, dare I say, some movement in the liberal world to talk about things like individual meritocracies and freedoms and things that don't sound in the end predatory while I live in a gated community, reaping the benefits of a capitalist system, but while sustaining a rhetoric that protects me from looking at the predatory systems my existence is keeping in play. So I think that's I appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate thinking about it that way. That makes sense to me.
But even the way that the bankers talk to the real estate agent,
yeah,
right? I mean, they're very degrading to her also, right? And you know, it's like Angela Davis said, if they come for me in the morning, they will come for you in the night, right? So, I mean, these guys don't don't give anybody any slack, right? Including this woman who's doing their dirty deeds. And as we find out, if anything goes down, she's going to be the one to get in trouble because she's signing everything, right? And so she becomes this pawn, but it speaks to this notion of white female complicity, but also white male, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of any other word, but ugliness, right? Even toward their own, right? Well, and so, you know, I think one thing we haven't talked about is kind of the treatment of women in this show. And I think that's important. And, you know, I don't know if I'm the person to talk about this or not, but
Mhm.
right, there's a very specific treatment of women that happens in this show, right? From the real estate agent to Lucky to Betty, to the other women in the neighborhood, to the woman singing, what's it called, Nathan? Black Joe?
Yep. I can't remember the name of it now, but yeah, I think it is just called Black Joe. Yep.
But yeah, these representations of women in this show, right? It's pretty interesting to me, um, because while they are extremely nasty, there's still a certain treatment that they receive, right? So the pregnant woman's husband, we know he's pretty much abusive to her, right? Um, we know what's happened to Betty with her father, right? We can assume that there's been sexual assault there. You know, we know the way Lucky's body is treated by these white men. You know, we know the realtor is seen as a pawn, right? And it's easy to dismiss her and insult her, right? So I think this is layer also of, you know, how do we read the way they've written women in this show also, right? And not giving the realtor and, you know, the women in the neighborhood any kind of slack or anything, but there's something to be said about the way white men treat women throughout these episodes as well, right? As you know, are they dispensable? You know, what is it? And I mean, I'm still grappling with it. I'm no expert in that area, but you know, we see a really there's something about the way they've written this into that show also that I think bears maybe further examination at some point. Because I will tell you, you know, when I first watched this and we were going to talk about it, I really was going to say Betty was my favorite character because I think she shows the complexity and this is the reason I like this show because I think it's so messy and I like messiness. You know, this is messiness around her character, right? That she is this evil woman, but that she's also had evil done to her, right? And I think there's something really intriguing about that. And we know what happens to her in the end, right? How her life is played out, which is, I hate to say fitting, but the fact that no one probably will ever know what happened to Betty is really interesting to me, right? This body just disappears. The assumption is that Henry had something to do with it, but you know, the audience, the viewer knows better, but that her body probably won't ever turn up, right? She becomes this missing character. But there's some kind of complexity to her, right? So from that moment when she is touched by that black body, right? When Lucky slaps her, that's where it just all unravels for her, right? She hates blackness so much that drives her to her own demise, right? Um, and so there's really something, I'm not sure what the connection is yet. I keep thinking through it, but there's something about that cult of white womanhood, and that so hatefulness of the black body, and then when it makes contact with you, what happens to her, right? And don't forget, you know, when she goes in and she starts peeling off that wallpaper, what she's, you know, what we see underneath that is what? It's that same mold, that black mold that she talks about, right? And so, well, that's it, right? I mean, blackness to her represents mold. You know, once it's there,
Right.
you can't get rid of it, right? And so there's such a complexity to her character, and I think Alison Peel does a great job of playing that, right? This pure evilness, but also this kind of you don't feel a sadness for her per se, but you know, you feel, I don't know, you feel this duplicity of some sort, right? There's this woman who's so vile, who says the N-word, right? But then she, you know, but those actions that she does, they lead to her death, right? Oh, crap! I shouldn't have said that in case people haven't seen it, but you can edit that out. But
No, they've been out long enough,
yeah,
right? They've been out long enough.
so what that
Um,
do to you?
I mean, Betty is in a way a tragic figure, but yet she's not a tragic figure. You know what I mean? Because like she's tragic in the classic kind of Aristotelian sense because like her flaw leads to her undoing,
Mhm.
right? And that and her undoing becomes a larger kind of commentary about how whiteness projects its own kinds of irrational uh, fantasies of the violent other onto itself and is driven by that, right? I mean, what I found so fascinating about that specific plot line was it reminded me so much of like the controversy of the Central Park Five, right? Where Henry becomes blamed for this white criminal act by, of all people, the milkman, George Bell, right? And the series ends in a way where you would expect that becomes like the lingering kind of suspicion among everybody in the community. It's like that doesn't go away, right? That crime is not um and it just reminds me so much of the Central Park Five, right? I mean, I should say that the Exonerated Five now, but I mean, and again, I think that's the thing that I think becomes really uncomfortable for a lot of white audiences, I imagine, right? Because it really forces you to look at yourself and your complicity in these larger structures and these larger narratives that have their own kind of agency once they take root, right? And the show becomes a kind of meta commentary on that, right? Through its chronicling of tropes of anti-blackness to the way in which it kind of shows us the interpersonal violence and then juxtaposes that with the institutional violence and the way in which they kind of symbiotically relate to each other in
exactly.
very gruesome ways.
Yeah, it's the retribution also in a way, right? Because it's when you just made me think about this, when Betty gets slapped, once that black body touches her, right?
Mhm.
Um, the alarm is sounded, right? And so we can think about Emmett Till, right? The supposed whistling at the white woman, or we can think about of Tulsa, right? What's what started that mob violence in Tulsa, right? Was the attack on the white female body, right? And so it kind of creates, once again, we talked earlier about this creation, what building the build up to forms of mob violence, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so it is after that touch where Allison loses it and leaves, right, that we see the mob violence build up again. Um, so does Betty's body and Betty's death become, is that a story of retribution
Mm.
for all these other historical moments, right? So Betty's actual, that persona, her character really drives a lot of this show, I think,
Mhm.
right? That the building of mob violence, um, the cult of white womanhood, the what happens when the black body dare touch the white
Mhm.
feminine form,
Mm.
right? Because historically, that has created, riots and mob violence onto black bodies, right? Because there's that purity of the white woman. And so they're playing around with that in this series, right?
Yeah.
They're playing around with this purity of the white woman's body, right? So, because Alison Peel is representative of that. Everything she does is very prim and proper, right? When
Yeah.
she's meeting with the ladies, it's very prim and proper, right? But then we see that played with, that myth is played with in this show a lot, right? Even when Lucky goes to the woman's house, when we hear the story of I'm forgetting, Annette Beaumont, right?
Mhm.
There's this thing of womanhood going on in the house, right? The house has to be clean, right? And so it's playing with that kind of that 50s genre also of the housewife's place. And it's deconstructing and dismantling all of that, right? To kind of show the madness surrounding that. So
Mm.
I think it does a good job with bringing that in also, right? It's a way to think about, how do we talk about the roles that women play in this series. Um,
Well, I really liked your statement, the madness that surrounds the clean house, right? And for me, that relates to what stays the same in the world because of the way you live your life.
mhm,
And while she's keeping her house clean, and that's her border for her own sanity, and it feels good to her, there's a whole world of trauma outside that's being maintained because of that pure life. Um, for me, as a psychologist, when I've had to just come to the idea of referring to humans as embodiments of context. And the question is for all of us is what are we going to do about the context we've embodied? And how are we going to shape the embodiment of others? What are the things we're going to pass on in the world that will be embodied by others? And I think you see a lot of characters in this show not resist, but basically embody the hate of the context. And that's definitely horror.
mhm,
And to see that happen at individual scales, group scales, and then cultural scales played out, living in that is pure horror. And I don't want to say I think this show did a wonderful job of doing that, because I almost get to the point where, like episode 9, like I said, just put the phone down and witness. The commentary is not the point, and that's kind of how I felt. At the same time, I think so. For example, trauma gets trauma, gets trauma, gets trauma, to the point where there's the scene with the black mother with the axe in the basement, right? And what we see is this family move itself out of context. We're not going to embody this hate and destroy ourselves, right? That's what seems to move through, even though many other characters embody the hate and it destroys them. So this struggle to what you do with hate, this permeates the show from top to bottom. And I think it did that extremely well. That and yeah.
yep.
So what we're going to do now is give every panelist an opportunity to sort of say their final take on our discussion and on the show as well. And we'll start with Dr. Stephen Hunt.
I just, great conversation this evening, and there's so many different themes that we could pull out that we did talk about tonight. I think the timing of this, I know we talked about this, how does this fit within our current culture? That aligning with the Derek Chauvin trial is a really interesting time. And I hope that it provides a mechanism to facilitate conversations like these. More conversations like this are extremely important at this time. So there's so many things to take away from it, but what it stimulated in terms of the questions that we need to be thinking about and the way that we need to be talking to each other was a really important takeaway for me. And if you're interested in finding me on social media, you can find me on Twitter at skhunt, SKHUNT 2 on Twitter.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We'll go on to Dr. Byron Craig. I guess I introduced.
Well, for me, I thought it was, I keep, and I talked about this earlier at the beginning of it, I just kind of want to come back to it. And I really think, and it kind of picks on what you were saying, Dr. Hunt, for us to begin thinking about this conversations, I think for me, the show really, a big thing for this show was really thinking about this notion of we want America to look like us, right? And I think that's what the show really does throughout the 10 episodes. I think it really does a good job of defining where we are today, right? Where we see what we're seeing in politics now, right? a move away from this notion of, serious policy change that needs to happen to this notion of, I don't, we've got to have people in place who agree that we want America to still to look like us, right? And I think throughout all 10 episodes, they're playing around with that. In a way, we see this happening through each moment of trauma that happens. These moments of trauma and haunting are happening because this is fear of, there goes my everything, right? So, if we let these people move into this neighborhood, well, we can't have that because we want this neighborhood to look like us, and looking like us is the right thing, right? I think we see that playing out in the Covenant episodes, where we see the characters sitting around and they can't accept these two Black characters who have come into their space, right? We see this playing out in, excuse me, in Compton. They can't be in this space because they don't look like us. And so I think that's, for me, what this show is really useful for, is starting to think about this idea of, what does America look like? And who gets to decide what America looks like? And the notion of, if we don't start putting this idea of equity first, because this show plays around with this notion of equity throughout the series, America could dangerously start looking like what these people want America to look like, starting in their own neighborhood, right? And so that was my takeaway from it. So I thank you for indulging this being a way to talk
Please.
about the show. But so if you want to find me, I'm on Twitter, and I'm going to stumble over this, at Byron B. Craig, and on Instagram at Steve Byron. Yes, that is it. And of course, I'm on Facebook under Byron Craig. So I certainly love for you to reach out if you have any questions or have further comments about anything I said this evening.
Fantastic. Dr. Nathan Carpenter.
So I'll give two takes. One, I think, again, because I do the coverage of social media and look at all that, and then try to relate it to the show. So I think the biggest takeaway that I came from putting those two together is that this show is really misunderstood. In terms of what was getting the most attention, what was getting retweeted the most. And again, the role of trauma, as we've been talking through it, is so important. And it raises to me questions about, who is this show for as well? And I think we see some of that come up in, again, not only this conversation, but also in the Twitter and social media chatter about it. And, there's a sense out there that, the show's getting criticism because of the violence and because of the trauma, and in relationship with other shows that are already out there and the current context, people are exhausted with having to confront trauma. And I think what the show does, and maybe part of the answer, of course, is that this show is for white people who need to be confronted with the horrors of whiteness, right? But I think thinking about that shift and approaching this, I guess, like Scott has been saying all along, less analytically and more just experiencing the horror of it, to the point that maybe for a second it can actually start to have some empathy, right? And I think that may be some of the big takeaway here for the rest of society, and for our current moment, is that empathy, especially for those who have gone through so much. And again, there's no way for me to ever, in any capacity, begin to know what it's like. But I think this show at least calls it out and puts it into a context that is at least understandable, and that is more than spectacle, right? I think none of this is violence for the sake of glorification or entertainment, right? I don't look at this show as entertainment. This is art in one of the I guess truest senses of having you confront major issues. So I guess putting it all together, again, the questions for me will still continue to be, who is this show for? And I can think of a few people in my life that I can now recommend this to. I think the difficulty is I can't just say everybody needs to go watch this. I don't think I can make that blanket statement, because I think again, what we've seen on social are reactions, based on some major assumptions about what happens. But also, I think there are people for whom so much would be lost, right? And so much of the important work that we've been uncovering tonight would also be lost. So I also don't want to say that either, but I think for us in this group, the challenge will be, who do we need to introduce this to in our lives so that they can also confront everything that we've been talking through. And if you're looking for me on social media, my Twitter handle is very punny, but it's the letter N, the number 8, and CARP, so Nate Carp, so N8 CARP. It's my personal Twitter handle. And then the lab, the Social Media Analytics Command Center, is at ISUSOC_SMACC. So ISUSOC_SMAC.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steve Rocco.
Well, let me just say I'm very, very happy to have joined all of you today. This evening, I should say, talking about this. I've learned a lot talking with all of this. I really enjoyed hearing the perspectives you brought to bear on this very complicated and very timely popular culture text. And I think the thing that I think the main takeaway that I want to put on the table as we kind of end this discussion this evening is really some kind of commentary about the title of this series. One of the things that we didn't talk about was the title "Them," and I think that the title encapsulates the kind of historical moment that we're in, and I think it's very aptly named. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was watching this show was, how that title would be used in the kind of character dialogue. And what I found fascinating, and I think it's reflective of the kind of conversation we've had about the kind of ways in which this show navigates trauma as a kind of trans-racial experience, a trans-historical experience, something that kind of shapes us as we internalize it. It's something that shapes our larger institutions. It's something that shapes time. And one of the things that I found fascinating about watching the show is that at different points, these characters are using that pronoun "them," right? We see Betty use it when talking about the Emorys. We see the other members of the Black community in Compton, right? When Lucky goes to the other side of Compton, those characters use them to talk about white people. Miles, this kind of demonic child that we see emerge in episode 9, uses the term when referencing Grafton and Martha when their stagecoach breaks down. He says, "They're coming," right? As if it's like a plague. And I think that "Them" is a really apt title because it really reflects the kind of dehumanization and polarization of othering that not only prevails the history of the United States, but then also in this present moment right now. And I think that for me, this is a text that really reflects the historical era that we're in. There's a number of other texts that we've seen, like Watchmen, like Lovecraft Country, Get Out, that really deal with and grapple with the complexities of race and history, and the kind of way in which history kind of serves as a kind of sedimentation of memory on our kind of collective experience and our collective consciousness. And I think that this show, despite the controversies of it, in many ways, I would almost say that the show anticipates the critiques of it, because the show really reflects to us the way in which different audiences kind of assume a kind of fantasy of gratification in seeing the violence of the other, right? I mean, that's a whole nother thing we could potentially interrogate at some point. I don't want to open this up again, but I mean, like, I think, Nathan, when you're talking about like the I should say, Dr. Carpenter, when you're talking about like that this is not spectacle. I mean, it's not spectacle, right? This is not kind of, the kind of, glamorized violence that we see in action flicks, right? The violence in this show is meant to make a point and makes you uncomfortable. And that's what makes this show, I think, important in this moment, right? It's not comforting to see this, but the fact that we have a number of people assuming that watching this show is a kind of exercise in comfort, or that it's somehow there's a certain kind of, I don't know, libidinal reaction to watching the violence of the racial other, I think tells us something about this moment that we're in. And the title "Them," I think, names that phenomenon actually fairly well.
Fantastic. Where can we find you on social media?
Well, I used to have a Facebook account
Mm.
until I deleted it after their IPO. So I
Mm.
don't do social media. I do have a LinkedIn account, so
It's up to you.
You can find me on LinkedIn. I eventually might get a Twitter account, but at this point I don't. But you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can just Google me. My faculty page has my contact information as well.
Thank you so much. So I have to tell you all, this, I'm trying to not to use words like "I love this show." That's just not how I want to talk about it. But the richness of the conversation we're having could go on for another 5 hours, no doubt. So trying to put my experience and thoughts about this show into a few words, what I very much love and appreciate about what they did was show what happens when you destabilize whiteness and no one in the white crowd disagrees. And it's almost like a multi-generational story of bystander syndrome. What happens when we just let this escalate? And the reason I find that encouraging is because this conversation is exactly that, right? It's that, say, wait, let's not do this. Let's not do this. Let's go a different way. Let's try a different way of being together. I'm, to be honest to God, I just put this bystander syndrome thing together in the last 5 minutes. You decenter whiteness, you make people scared. And then if that there's no one in that group that says, let's not go this way, very, very horrible things continue to happen. And it asks us, how are you going to have groups? What's it mean to have a group? Is your group going to define itself by hating another one? If that's how your group is going to define itself, then that's a very dangerous group. And I think part of what we've been doing with the Extending Empathy Project and with this conversation is asking ourselves and asking each other, how do we be together and be different? What kind of groups do we make when we're not basing our groups on hating another group? Because that's the simplest way to make a group, to be honest, is define yourself negatively in relation to another. So for me, this kind of persistent tension, us bringing this tension to the public, how are you making your groups? Are you doing it by hating others? And just keeping that consciously on the table, that's the gig. That's how we be anti-racist, and just keep doing it, and just keep doing it. I think when we think we've solved the problem is when we make ourselves vulnerable again. So being consciously aware of how we're keeping groups together, and trying to make sure we're not doing that through hating of another, is kind of what we're after here. So you can find me on the Illinois State University Psychology webpage. You can find me on Twitter at @dark_loops. If you want to leave any comments about this conversation, feel free to do so on this YouTube page. We'll be glad to answer them, because I'm sure we're all going to get together again and talk about the divide. So, gentlemen, it's been a sincere pleasure. And anybody out there listening, we truly appreciate you taking the time to hear what we have to say. And until next time, good night.